The old man's hands were still shaking when he realized the woman he'd just pulled from the fire had no pulse, no breath, and eyes that reflected light like an animal's. But she was walking, and she was smiling. It started 3 nights earlier, in a part of Boston most people pretend doesn't exist. Marcus Webb had lived in that neighborhood for 42 years. Ever since he'd come back from a war nobody wanted to talk about anymore. He kept to himself, ran a small bookshop that barely broke even, and every evening at exactly 7:15, he'd lock up and walk the same route home. Past the bodega with the flickering sign, past the burned-out shell of what used to be a church, past the alley where the homeless gathered around barrel fires when winter bit down hard. Marcus was 71 years old, and he'd seen enough of the world to know that most people were just trying to survive it. He didn't judge. He didn't preach. But on cold nights, he'd stop by that alley with whatever day-old pastries the bodega was throwing out. Maybe a few dollars if he had them. The folks there knew him, trusted him, called him Bookman because nobody remembered his real name. On this particular Tuesday, the temperature had dropped to 18 degrees, and the wind off the harbor cut through clothing like broken glass. Marcus was heading home when he heard the screaming. Not the usual street noise, not a fight or a drunk. This was different. This was terror, pure and primal, the kind of sound that reaches into your chest and squeezes. He ran toward the alley, his old knees protesting, his breath coming in white clouds. The barrel fire had spread. Somehow, impossibly, the flames had jumped to a pile of cardboard shelters and were racing through the makeshift camp like a living thing. People were scattering, grabbing what they could, shouting names into the chaos. And that's when Marcus saw her. A woman, maybe 30, maybe 50. It was hard to tell under the grime and layers of torn clothing. She was trapped behind a wall of flame, frozen in place, not screaming anymore, just staring at the fire with an expression Marcus couldn't read. Everyone else had run, but she stood there perfectly still as the flames closed in. Marcus didn't think. 20-year-old instincts from a jungle halfway around the world kicked in, the same instincts that had kept him alive when better men died. He grabbed someone's abandoned coat, wrapped it around his arms, and plunged into the fire. The heat was enormous, overwhelming, but he reached her, grabbed her around the waist, and pulled. She was lighter than she should have been, almost weightless, and she didn't fight him. She just let herself be carried, her body limp and compliant in his arms. He dragged her out onto the sidewalk, 20 feet from the flames, and laid her down. That's when he noticed. Her clothes were singed, her skin blackened with soot, but underneath, when he wiped her face, there wasn't a single burn. Not one blister. The fire had touched her, should have consumed her, but her skin was smooth and unmarked. Marcus pressed his fingers to her neck, searching for a pulse. Nothing. He put his ear to her chest. Silence, no heartbeat, no breath. He'd done this before, in the war, checking bodies, and he knew dead when he felt it. This woman was dead, and then she opened her eyes. They were wrong. That was Marcus's first thought. The color was normal enough, a pale gray, but they caught the streetlight and threw it back like a cat's eyes, like polished mirrors. She blinked once, twice, and sat up smoothly, effortlessly, the way no one who'd just been pulled from a fire should be able to move. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was clear, unaffected by smoke or trauma. "You didn't have to do that." Marcus scrambled backward, his heart hammering. You weren't breathing. You didn't have a pulse." She tilted her head, studying him with those strange, reflective eyes. "Didn't I?" She touched her own chest, as if checking. "I forget sometimes. The details." "What are you?" The question came out before Marcus could stop it. The woman stood, brushing ash from her clothes with casual precision. Around them, sirens were approaching, the fire department responding to the blaze. She looked at the flames, then back at Marcus, and something like sadness flickered across her face. "I'm old," she said simply. "Older than this city, older than the country it's built on. And you, Marcus Webb, are the last of something that should have died out centuries ago." Marcus felt his blood turn to ice water. "How do you know my name?" "Because I've been looking for you." She stepped closer, and despite every instinct screaming at him to run, Marcus stood his ground. "Your great-grandfather was Sir William Webb, wasn't he?" "Knight Templar, one of the few who escaped when the order was destroyed in 1307. He fled to the New World, changed his name, hid his legacy. But he passed something down through your family, didn't he? A duty, a trust." Marcus's mouth went dry. His grandfather had told him stories when he was a boy, stories his father had dismissed as senile ramblings, stories about knights and sacred relics and an oath that transcended death itself. In his shop, hidden behind a false panel in his office, there was a box. Iron, ancient, locked with a key Marcus wore on a chain around his neck but had never used. His grandfather had made him swear, on his deathbed, to guard it, and never, under any circumstances, to open it. "I don't know what you're talking about," Marcus lied. The woman smiled, and it was a terrible thing to see. Not cruel, not malicious, but deeply, profoundly sad. "Yes, you do. And Marcus, I need you to listen very carefully, because we don't have much time. That fire wasn't an accident. They're coming. They've been searching for 700 years, and they've finally found you." "Who's coming?" Before she could answer, the alley exploded. Not with fire this time, but with something else, something Marcus's mind struggled to process. Figures emerged from the shadows, 6 of them, moving in ways that human bodies shouldn't move, too fast, too fluid. They wore the faces of ordinary people, homeless men and women Marcus recognized from the neighborhood. But their eyes were wrong, all of them, reflecting light like the woman's. "Run," the woman said, but she didn't run. She turned to face the approaching figures, and her body changed. Not dramatically, not like in the movies, but subtly, terribly. Her spine straightened. Her hands flexed, and Marcus saw that her fingernails had become something else, something sharp and dark. The air around her shimmered like heat waves, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a resonance that made Marcus's teeth ache. "He's under my protection. The old laws still hold." One of the figures, wearing the face of a man Marcus had given coffee to just last week, laughed. "The old laws died with your kind, Watcher. The world has forgotten. The compact is broken." "Then let's remind them," the woman said, and she moved. Marcus had been in combat. He'd seen men fight and die, but this was something else entirely. The woman became a blur of motion, impossibly fast, meeting the 6 figures with a violence that was both beautiful and horrifying. They fought in silence, no grunts or cries, just the sound of impact, of bodies colliding with force that cracked the pavement beneath them. And Marcus ran, not because he was a coward, but because some deep ancient part of his DNA recognized that he was watching something humans were never meant to witness. He ran through streets he'd walked for 40 years, the key around his neck suddenly feeling heavy as lead, burning against his skin through his shirt. He made it to his shop, fumbled with the locks, got inside and bolted the door behind him. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely turn on the lights. The shop was exactly as he'd left it, rows of used books, the smell of old paper and leather, the electric space heater humming in the corner. Normal. Safe. Except it wasn't. Not anymore. Marcus went to his office, moved the bookshelf that hid the panel, and pulled out the iron box. It was about the size of a shoebox, covered in symbols he'd never been able to decipher, cold to the touch even in the heated room. The key hung around his neck, a simple iron thing his grandfather had given him 70 years ago. "Open it." The woman's voice came from behind him, and Marcus spun around, his heart nearly stopping. She was standing in his office, though he'd locked every door, every window. She looked exactly as she had in the alley, unmarked, composed, except now there was blood on her hands. Dark blood that looked wrong in color and consistency. "How did you—" "We don't have time for questions you're not ready to hear the answers to," she interrupted. "Marcus, what's in that box is the last piece of something that holds the world together. A binding, a seal. And there are things, old things, hungry things, that want it broken. I've spent 7 centuries making sure they never found it. Now they have, and I can't fight them all. Not alone." "What are you?" Marcus asked again, backing against the wall. The woman was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of ages. "I'm what humans used to call a watcher. Before your kind learned to write, before you built cities, we were here. Our purpose was to guard the boundaries, to keep certain doors closed, certain things locked away from your world. Most of my kind are gone now, dead or sleeping or simply faded into nothing. I'm the last in this part of the world. And you, Marcus Webb, last keeper of the Templar Trust, are the last human who knows what's truly at stake." Marcus looked at the box, then at the woman, then back at the box. "My grandfather said never to open it. He said the world would end if I did. Your grandfather was right. But Marcus, if you don't open it now, if you don't do what your bloodline has been preparing to do for 700 years, The world ends anyway, just slower, darker, and there'll be no one left to remember it was ever any different. Outside, Marcus heard sirens. Police, fire department, maybe ambulances. Normal people dealing with normal emergencies. But underneath, if he listened carefully, he could hear other sounds. Footsteps on the roof. Something scratching at the door. The world he'd known was peeling away, revealing something underneath, something ancient and terrible and true. "Tell me what to do," Marcus said, and his voice didn't shake. The woman smiled, and this time it was genuine, almost warm. "Open the box. Read what's inside, and then, Marcus Webb, last night of an order that died before your nation was born. You do what you were always meant to do. You fight. Not because you'll win, but because someone has to remember there was ever a fight at all." Marcus took the key from around his neck. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory, that last conversation in the hospital room. "When the time comes, you'll know. And Marcus, whatever you do, don't be afraid. The Templars never were." He slid the key into the lock. It turned smoothly, as if it had been waiting centuries for this exact moment. The box opened. Inside was a single piece of parchment, yellow with age, covered in writing that Marcus somehow, impossibly, could read. And as his eyes moved across the words, he understood. He understood everything. The fire in the alley hadn't been targeting the homeless. It had been targeting him. The figures with their wrong eyes and stolen faces were just the advance guard of something much worse. And the oath his great-grandfather had sworn, the trust his family had carried through centuries of silence and secrecy. It wasn't about protecting an object or guarding a treasure. It was about holding a door shut. One last door, the final seal, and that door was him. Marcus looked up at the woman, the watcher, and saw in her ancient eyes a reflection of his own mortality, his own insignificance, and paradoxically, his terrible importance. "How long do we have?" "Minutes," she said. "Maybe less. They'll tear through your door soon. They'll take you, break you, use your bloodline to open what should stay closed. Unless you complete the ritual. Unless you bind yourself, permanently, irrevocably, to the seal." "What happens to me?" The woman's expression was unreadable. "You become the lock, forever. Conscious but not alive, present but not physical. A living ward holding back the tide until the stars go dark and time itself forgets your name." Marcus was 71 years old. He'd lived a quiet life, mostly alone, selling books in a failing shop in a neighborhood most people avoided. He had no wife, no children, no legacy except an iron box and an oath made by a man who died before America existed. And now, at the end of everything, he finally understood why his life had been so small, so isolated, so carefully guarded. Because this was all it had ever been for. "Okay," Marcus said simply. "Tell me the words." Outside, the scratching at the door became pounding. Wood splintered. Inhuman voices called his name. The woman stepped forward, took his hands in hers, and began to speak in a language that predated Latin, that might have predated language itself. And Marcus repeated the words, feeling them change him from the inside out, feeling his body begin to dissolve, not into death, but into something else, something that existed in the spaces between moments, in the cracks of reality. The last thing he saw before the change completed was the woman's face, tears streaming down her cheeks, her ancient eyes full of a grief that had no bottom. "Thank you," she whispered. "Last night, last guardian, last light in the dark." And Marcus Webb, who'd saved a woman who wasn't human and discovered he'd never been quite human himself, became the thing he'd always been meant to be. A lock, a seal, a final ward against the hungry dark. The door burst open. The creatures poured in, and they found nothing but an empty room, a closed box, and a woman with mirror eyes standing guard over something they could never reach. Would never reach, not while one last Templar held the line in a place beyond time and death. The shop remained, untouched by the chaos outside, a small island of peace in a neighborhood that had forgotten how to sleep. And sometimes, on cold nights, people walking past would swear they saw an old man in the window, standing watch, eternal and unchanging, the last guardian of a world that would never know his name. But the world kept turning. The sun kept rising, and somewhere in the spaces between heartbeats, Marcus Webb stood his post, forever vigilant, forever faithful, forever alone, the last Templar, the final knight, the forgotten guardian of everything,